Welcome to On Health with Houston Methodist. I'm Zach Moore. I'm a photographer and editor here, and I'm also a longtime podcaster.
I'm Katie McCallum, former researcher turned health writer, mostly writing for our blogs.
Hey, Katie, do you drink milk?
Yeah, Zach, I drink milk.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not going to say I drink a lot of it, but, you know.
Do you have a favorite kind of milk?
My milk journey has actually been like a winding path that's changed over the years. So somewhere in my mid-20s, like milk started kind of hurting my stomach.
Okay.
I started trying all of the plant-based milks. And so I've like tried almost every option that's out there. And I've kind of come back towards like once they started making the lactose-free dairy milks, that's where I went back because I love that's the taste of milk I like. I never was a big fan of plant milks. So now I'm back on like a lactose-free dairy milk. And every now and then I splurge and I get the ones that are called ultra filtered. They're pricey, but I like those just because they have like extra protein and stuff in them.
Do you have a favorite plant-based milk?
I don't know. I don't really like any of them. I'm going to be perfectly honest. Like they all just don't taste like anything that I really want. How about you? I mean,
there is a different taste to them, I agree. And I've had a milk journey myself.
Talk us through this milk journey.
Well, you know, when you're a kid, you just drink whatever's at the school cafeteria. You know, we all have the little cardboard boxes.
Well, and when we were
straws.
kids, there weren't plant milks really yet.
Right.
Maybe soy.
Your choices were white milk, chocolate milk, strawberry milk.
Yeah, and then maybe like a 1% in a whole milk.
Yeah.
And like if soy was around, I don't think that became popular till like my teens.
Right.
And then now, like, there's a million options, obviously.
As a kid, you drink a lot of milk. I don't know, like either with your cereal or with your cookies and that sort of thing. I don't know if it's just the way of things, but as you get older, you drink less milk. Maybe we're just speaking for ourselves here, but you just don't drink as much milk as when you're younger.
Yeah.
And you'll hear me mention this in our conversation today with our expert, but I heard a factoid a few years ago that humans are the only animals that drink milk, not only beyond their own adolescence, but drink milk from other animals. And it's like, wow, that really blew my mind.
Yeah.
That was like a question everything you ever thought you knew kind of statement.
I don't think I would think of that on my own, but like as you say it, like makes sense.
So I was like, why, this is weird, but maybe we should be drinking plant-based milk. And so then I experimented with some, almond milk.
Well, I don't think any other species are drinking plant-based milks either.
So I think I've come back around, especially after this conversation you're about to hear us have with our expert today. I'm just going to go back to dairy milk.
What was it? What was your go-to before this conversation?
Well, probably almond milk.
Okay.
With extra protein, because that's a very important component that is missing in a lot of plant-based milks, right? I mean, and there's a lot of great reasons to drink plant-based milk if you have certain, reactions to dairy products and whatnot. But also, they're missing some properties that you need.
People, I will say, even when I was realizing like, okay, dairy hurts my stomach, let me switch to a plant-based milk, I really did think they were like nutritional equivalents. Like, I'm just going to swap in some almond milk or some soy milk. And like some of them are pretty good, but then I was shocked when it was like, oh, this thing that you think is kind of just like milk is really not like milk.
Right.
But we're going to talk about that today.
We are. We talked to Kelly Gaines. She's a registered dietitian here in Houston Methodist, and we went through all the different kinds of milk with her and tried to determine what might be the best fit for you. Let's get into it. I want to start off with the big question. What are your milk drinking habits? Do you like it? Do you have a preferred kind of milk? And has that changed at all over your lifetime?
So I do drink milk. I drink skim milk, ultra filtered, at home. When I was a kid, I did grow up drinking skim milk, but that's always kind of controlled by your parents, right? So that's what my parents put in the house, so that's what I had. I drank a lot more milk as a kid than I do now as an adult. Now I just kind of use it in my coffee or, maybe just a little bit with something on occasion. Or in cooking, like when I make pancakes or something.
Right.
So I don't drink a ton of milk just by itself.
You'll go home after a long day and pour yourself a nice, tall, cold glass of milk anymore, huh?
Not usually.
Now, how important is it, and of course everything is relative, so when I say how important, relatively speaking, is it to drink milk? Because regardless of the type of milk, and we'll go down those types shortly, that Got Milk campaign, right? It's been going on for decades now. It's got some really clever and effective commercials and posters with famous celebrities and characters, even fictional characters. So there's definitely been, a big push, if you will, for it in the public consciousness. Do you think like we need that as a society? Like, do we need to be reminded? Like, hey, by the way, drink your milk.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the U.S. dietary guidelines do recommend that we drink or that we have 2 to 3 servings of dairy a day. And from a health standpoint, low-fat and fat-free dairy products are healthier for us. So milk is kind of an easy way to have those options. You can also get that through yogurt. But when you look at something like cheese, which a lot of people love cheese, and I would say probably most people get their 2 to 3 servings from cheese a day, cheese isn't as healthy because it's higher in fat and it has all the sodium that's been added to it. So from that standpoint, yeah, encouraging people to get their dairy servings from milk can be a slightly healthier way to go. But it is interesting because when you look at the rest of the world, other countries drink way less milk than what we do. Maybe just 1 cup a day as opposed to like the 2 to 3 servings that they're recommending here. And they even have lower calcium recommendations in other parts of the world than they do here in the US. So yeah, marketing, right? But it's a way, they are trying to get us our calcium.
Right. Now, on that same note, we've always heard that milk will, keep your bones strong and help prevent osteoporosis. Now, in recent years, I've seen studies that attempt to question that, like it's not so cut and dry. Maybe what is the current understanding in the medical field of the correlation between milk and osteoporosis?
Yeah, so you're right. There have been a few studies in recent years that say, well, maybe, all this calcium that we're having isn't helping with our bone mineral density quite as much as we thought it did. But there's way more research that says it does. But it is primarily in our youth, right? So it's our childhood into our adolescence where we're building all this bone mineral density. And then once we get into adulthood, not really so much.
I feel like you see these studies that come out every few years, like, eating a box of chocolates a day could be good for you. One of those like almost contrarian studies.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and there's definitely a place for that. We should always be exploring, hey, is this current medical understanding, is it still accurate as we evolve and learn more? But people always want to talk about the hot news study that, hey, everything you thought was wrong. And that's not necessarily the case here.
Definitely.
Now, a factoid I heard a few years ago that really stuck with me, and I wanted to talk to you about it, is that, humans, we're the only species that not only do we drink milk from another species, but we drink it past our adolescence. So why is this?
Yeah, that's kind of like an evolutionary adaptation sort of thing, right? So we as a human species started raising livestock and domesticating these animals as a food source, which is great in times of food shortage. Being able to drink milk from other animals was actually even a source of clean water for us in times where we didn't have access to clean water. So milk is actually 87% water, like whole milk is. So if you think about it from that standpoint, like it's a survival kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Like we figured out a way to have a more consistent source of nutrients available to us versus having to go like hunt and gather and potentially not find food. We were able to start raising livestock and feed ourselves that way.
Yeah, no, and that's an excellent point, just thinking about having a liquid, right? I mean, in the old days, you had to go drill a well. Only so much water. I'm just gonna have some milk instead of some water.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're not worried so much about contamination, right?
Excellent. Now let's go down the kinds of milk. There's a lot. There's a lot more than I thought. Looking into this, I'm like, okay, well, you got your cow's milk, and then I don't know, like almond milk, and then maybe like a couple other ones. But there's a lot more. So let's go down the list, because kind of what I want to talk about here, to inform the listeners too, is like if you go to the grocery store and you're standing in front of the big freezer, like what is the best fit for you for milk? Because there are so many choices these days. So like you said, when we were kids, it's like, oh, what does mom have in the refrigerator? 2%? Sure. Okay, I'll eat that with my cookies when I get home from school. And you don't really think about it. Or the little, there's only so many little boxes, little cardboard boxes at the cafeteria,
Right.
And nowadays, like so many kinds of foods, there are so many options when it comes to milk. But let's start with the old reliable cow's milk. So there's whole milk. And is it fair to call this the most standard milk?
Maybe the most traditional milk. I would say more people that I talk to drink 2%. It's kind of been ingrained for a while now, I think, that, whole milk is too high fat. So people are willing to go to 2%, and they view that as a healthier option. But whole milk is definitely, I would say, the more traditional milk.
Now, is it the same as vitamin D milk? Because some of these milks I feel like I see interchangeably.
They sometimes market whole milk as vitamin D milk, but all of the dairy milks are fortified with vitamin D. So they could all be called vitamin D milk.
Okay.
Really.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. It's good to know. Yeah. It does depend, like you said, it's marketing. It's like, what label are they going to put on it? What are they trying to appeal to? You know, Vitamin D, it's its own conversation. We actually did a podcast about it not too long ago. So also, all of these cow's milk, they're typically pasteurized and homogenized. What does that mean exactly?
So the pasteurization process is to kill bacteria, right? So it helps it be more shelf stable. It makes sure that when they're, milking the cows and all of that, it's not contaminated with anything, so that it's safe for the consumer to drink. There are a couple different types of pasteurization as far as how high they heat the milk to, the temperature and the length of time, because if you have noticed, sometimes you can see milks that are shelf stable, right, that aren't refrigerated. So there are a couple different types of temperatures that they can use. So high heat pasteurization makes it shelf stable for even longer. But yes, it's just a way of keeping it safe for the public to consume, right, killing that bacteria. And yeast and molds too. Homogenization is where they actually break down the fat that's in the milk and make the fat globules smaller in size so that the milk's not separating so much. So the milk that we buy from the stores, right, it doesn't really separate with the fat on the top. But if you think about fat in water, normally fat would separate. So it's really just for a mouthfeel, like taste preference, visual preference when you're buying your milk.
Okay. Yeah, again, it's one of these things, you see it on a label, and we don't think about it. Like, so many words we just see, like pasteurized. I'm like, okay, I mean, I guess that's a good thing. but now we know what it means. I didn't know before, so thank you.
And if you think about it from a pasteurization standpoint, if you've thought about like raw milk at all, like sometimes if you go to farmers markets, you can get raw milk from local farmers that's not pasteurized. And that's always kind of the little like iffy, concern with purchasing raw milk is that you don't know if it's going to make you sick or not. So
now you mentioned 2% milk, 2% fat.
So it means that it has 2% fat in the milk.
Okay.
As opposed to whole milk, which is 4% fat.
When I think back to like what milk I even mentioned earlier, like when I drank as a kid, as we all, not everyone, but I think we all drank more milk when we were children probably. I just remember a big 2%. It was like what the particular brand that we got wherever was always like the blue carton. And I was like, that's how I know. Get that blue 2% carton. And talking about what's the standard or whatever, 2% seems to be the go-to. If there is a milk that if you go to the gas station looking for milk and they have a much lesser selection, you're probably going to find 2% there.
Yes, probably so. And I think for a lot of people, it has to do, again, with that mouthfeel and the thickness, right? So the people that I talk to, 2% is close enough in thickness to whole milk that they're still willing to drink it, but 1% starts to get a little bit too thin for them.
Let's talk about 1%. So that's also known as low-fat milk?
It is. And that has to do with just sort of the definitions of low-fat milk that have been set by the FDA, right? So a low-fat product has less than 3 grams of fat. So low-fat milk has less than 3 grams of fat. 2% milk would be considered a reduced fat milk because it has less fat than the original product.
Gotcha. Again, all these terminologies that just depending on what label they put on it, right? Because I'm like, well, if it's low-fat, how is that different than reduced fat? But low fat would be the lowest amount until you get to something like skim milk, I guess, which is
non-fat, zero fat. Yeah.
Fat-free milk.
Fat-free milk, exactly. And you'll see it marketed all 3 of those ways, right?
Right.
Skim, non-fat, fat-free.
That's why I need clarification here. So thank you. Now, what's the process of removing the fat? It's the same process. They just remove all of it instead of half of it? Or?
Correct. So actually, and as I was like reading this just to, confirm some of the details and things, I didn't realize that they remove all fat from milk and then add it back in.
Wow.
And they do that actually so that they have a standard product so that you don't risk having some milks that, are 4.5% fat or 3.5% fat. So they actually remove all fat from the milk and then add it back in depending on whether they're making whole milk 2%, 1%.
Interesting. You would not think they would do it that way, but that does make sense for the control element of it all.
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. So we've done whole milk, 2% milk, 1% milk, skim milk, organic milk. Now organic products have been a big health trend in recent years. What is the difference here between organic milk and all these other milks we've talked about so far?
Yes, and that's a great question. So organic milk means that the cows have been raised organically.
Okay.
Meaning that they have access to pastures for a certain amount of time during the year, like more pasture time than just being kept cooped up, being given feed. But then also their feed has to be organic, meaning that only organic pesticides and things like that would be used on the grass that they're eating, or when they are fed, corn or something, some kind of grain, that would all be organic. And then it also applies a bit to antibiotic use. So in our standard milk products, they can give a cow an antibiotic and then they wait, 96 hours or however long it takes for the antibiotics to get out of the cow's system before they would resume, using that milk for our food supply. But with organic cows, they're not allowed to use antibiotics at all. They can only use an antibiotic on the cow if the cow needs it to survive, and then the cow is sold. And it can't be used for organic milk anymore.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about lactose-free milk. In my research, I found that 60 to 70% of the population has some form of lactose intolerance. Is this accurate?
So it's correct. It's technically that they have some form of lactose malabsorption. So what happens is, and this was actually historically, it was more like 100% of the human population, that after kind of this infancy, childhood age, we would stop producing the lactase enzyme that helps us break down lactose. So symptoms of that, right, are going to be things like the, constipation and bloating and gas and some of those like discomforts that we can have. But so what happened when we were mentioning earlier how we started, raising livestock and that sort of thing. So some cultures actually evolved to continue producing the lactase enzyme into adulthood. But it's only like 36-ish% of the human population that actually has that. It's technically like a gene mutation that allows us to continue producing the lactase enzyme and digest it. But not everyone that has lactose malabsorption necessarily has symptoms. So it might be that they continue to produce really small amounts of the lactase enzyme. So they could drink like a tiny bit of milk in their coffee, right? And not have any symptoms from it. It's more just a volume thing for them, right? If they sit down and drink like that whole glass of milk after work, that they would have the symptoms from it.
Okay, so what is the process of making milk for the lactose intolerant?
Yeah, so a lactose-free milk, what they've actually done is they add lactase enzyme to the milk itself. Okay. So it breaks down the lactose in the milk before the person even drinks it.
Wow, okay. And is there any significant taste difference between this and the other milks?
Not really. Most people don't think that there is. Some people think that maybe it tastes slightly sweeter just because the lactose is broken down into even more simple sugars. But most people don't think it tastes any different.
Interesting. So yeah, I mean, you hear like, oh yeah, they're lactose intolerant, and you think like that's that percentage of the population. It's the majority of us all.
It actually is, yes. And it's actually more of the like Northern European population that has the ability to digest lactose. So it's more of like the Hispanic, African, American Indian, those types of populations that have more lactose intolerance.
Gotcha. Now, I love chocolate milk. When it comes to chocolate and strawberry milk, is there a best or healthiest, and I say those with quotation marks, of these? I mean, is it better to add the flavor yourself, like a chocolate syrup, or is it better to kind of buy it in the carton? It's like, here's your strawberry milk or something like that. Or does it just completely cancel out the health benefits of milk entirely? Or where is the good middle ground here with these flavored milks?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that it cancels out the health benefits entirely. I mean, you're still getting the calcium, the vitamin D, some of these great, nutrients that have been added to the milk and in the milk. And I would say drinking a chocolate milk as your dessert is probably better than a lot of alternatives, maybe like a donut or something that has even less nutritional value, right?
Gotcha.
In addition to the donuts, maybe not, the best addition. But yeah, so it's interesting when you look to see, because so your standard milks that you might buy, like a chocolate milk carton from the grocery store, do have a decent amount of added sugars in them. So it's about 15 grams of added sugars in a cup of chocolate milk. So to give you an idea of what that looks like for us, the American Heart Association recommends that women not consume more than 24 grams of added sugars a day, men not more than 36 grams of added sugars a day. So for kids, it's going to be like the 24 or even a little bit less. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at 15 grams, like more than half of that coming from 1 cup of chocolate milk, that's kind of a lot towards your daily total.
Yeah.
But it could fit, right? If you were using that as kind of your sweet treat or your dessert or whatever it was for the day. when I was looking to compare the little cartons that they sell, which in my mind are marketed towards kids, right? As in like, yeah, this little carton that they can take to school with them or whatever. Those had a little bit less. So they had about 10 grams of added sugar in the little 1 cup carton. Some of the ultra filtered milks, if you've seen like, and maybe we'll talk about ultra filtered milks in a minute, but the ultra filtered milks like the Mootopia brand by H-E-B or the Fairlife brand, they only have 5 grams of added sugars in them. And if you've tasted their chocolate milk, it tastes very chocolatey and very sweet and very decadent. But they're using some artificial sweeteners in there too.
Oh, okay.
So then it's kind of a personal preference of, okay, well, what's more important to me, limiting my added sugar or limiting my artificial sweeteners? So there are a few different options out there. And then you were asking about like adding your own syrup. So if
that's the way I've always done it traditionally, but
yeah, well, it does give you more control, right?
which could be a good or bad thing.
Correct. So when I was comparing, 1 tablespoon of Hershey's syrup has 10 grams of added sugar, which was the same as in the little cartons that they sell. Nesquik, for 2 tablespoons of powder, 10 grams of added sugar, and that's kind of the serving size on both of them. So it ends up being the same.
Okay.
And it might just be a taste preference, because I do feel like it tastes a little bit different, whether, it has the syrup added to it or it's the pre-chocolated milk.
Yeah, just have a little self-control if you're putting that chocolate syrup in there.
Yeah, if you're not limiting to a tablespoon, then I would say, buy what's on the shelves.
Yeah, you want a nice, a nice milky cocoa color, as opposed to just pure brown in your chocolate milk.
Yes.
That's probably the way to go. So let's talk about full cream milk used for coffee, cooking. I mean, how much is too much if you're putting milk in your coffee, for example, or your tea?
The full cream, right? So there are variants in that. So a lot of people use half and half in their coffee, right? Which is going to be actually half whole milk, half cream. And then you have just whipping cream, and then you have heavy cream or heavy whipping cream. And again, that's all fat content, right? So just the regular whipping cream one is 30 to 36% milk fat.
Okay.
Heavy whipping cream or heavy cream is more than 36% fat. So if we're comparing that to whole milk that was only 4%, it's a really big difference. It's also not, it's the quote unquote bad fats, right? It's the ones that they are recommending that we reduce from a heart health standpoint. So it's not a good kind of fat that you're, it's not like almonds or avocado or something that you're adding. It's the less healthy kind. So when you start looking at amounts, 2 tablespoons of the heavy whipping cream has about 7 grams of saturated fat in there. And really for the day, we should only be having about 10 to 13 grams. So it's a pretty big chunk of your daily total if you were using that. And that's a great question, because that's actually what some diets like keto promote. And keto has been so popular in the years that people switch to using, heavy cream and that kind of stuff in there. But it adds a lot of saturated fat. And I've seen several people who have seen their cholesterol numbers go up in response to that switch.
It's a real kind of easy thing to lose track of. You're like, oh, you pour a little of this in here, and then a month later you've consumed way more percentage of milk fat than you thought you ever had.
Definitely, because you were mentioning color with the chocolate milk, right? And that's what people do with their cream, too. It's like, it needs to be creamy enough.
So let's talk about buttermilk. Got its name from being the leftovers from churning butter, but it's not that anymore. What is buttermilk these days?
Yeah, so like you said, it was the leftovers from butter, so it was actually like a fermented liquid. So now what they do is they actually add a bacteria to it that does the fermentation process on its own, right? So it produces some lactic acid in there, which gives it like a tangier flavor. And it's the same way that they would make like yogurt or sour cream or something like that, right? So it becomes a fermented dairy product. It's just still a liquid.
Now, do people drink buttermilk? And no shame if you do, listeners. But I've only seen it used in the cooking applications, pancakes, biscuits.
When I've come across people that drink it, it's usually like the older generation.
Okay.
And I think that must have just been, again, kind of like we grew up and we had this sometimes and we drank it. And so they actually enjoy, I think, that slightly tangier taste.
Okay.
But I have not met a lot of like the younger generation now that actually drinks buttermilk. But you're right. It's used in cooking a lot because of the acidic properties. And so then it interacts with baking soda and helps your baked goods rise and all of that.
Gotcha. Now, real quick, I want to run down the other kinds of animal milk that we consume. Are there any interesting things to note about goat milk, buffalo milk, sheep milk, camel milk?
I mean, in general, they're all nutritionally pretty similar to cow's milk. They potentially have a little bit less lactose in them. So if you were having a little bit of lactose intolerance, then maybe you would tolerate them a little bit better.
Okay.
But they're not extremely easy to find in the grocery stores. I don't know if you've ever seen camel's milk in a
No, I
grocery
had not.
store.
I was not even aware that that was a thing that we did as humans, drink camel's milk. But
Yeah. You can find, I would say goat milk of all of them is
Right.
probably the one that you could actually find.
goat cheese, I mean, use that a lot. And
Exactly.
That kind of goes in the same, territory.
Yes, and sheep's milk. But so again, more often sheep's milk is actually used to make cheese versus just being consumed as milk. When I was looking it up, there is a little bit that says that goat's milk might have some anti-inflammatory benefits and things like that. Might be a little bit better tolerated in people that have cow's milk allergies. But if you look at the cost, it is so expensive. It was $10 for a half gallon.
Wow. See, now I'm afraid to try it because now I might like it. And
Yeah, and then who can afford to
my
keep
milk
that
budget
up?
is only so much, right? Okay, interesting. Now, you've mentioned ultra-filtered milk a few times. Let's talk about that. How did you come to choose that as your preferred milk?
So ultra-filtered milk, really, I feel like kind of became big in the market, I don't know, maybe 5 or so years ago. And I mean, of course, me seeing like all the new nutrition products and things, right? I came across it. And it was one of those things that almost seemed like too good to be true. It's this milk that was higher in protein than your standard milk and lower in carbohydrates. But other than that, it looked like it was just your standard milk. So I even reached out to a friend of mine that was working in the dairy industry at the time and asked her, like, is this for real? Is this really milk? What have they done to this? And she said, no, it's just, so it's part of that filtration process, right? We talked about even with that, like fat removal of all the milks that are out there. We know that our milk is all going through this kind of processing to make it what it is. So it's just a different way of filtering it. And so, like I said, it ends up having 1.5 times the amount of protein. So it can be really nice if you have a certain way of wanting to eat where you're trying to include a certain amount of protein throughout your day or at your meals. It can make it a little bit easier to meet that. Or if you were somebody that was worried about your glucose levels and how many carbohydrates you were having in a meal, since it has half the amount of carbohydrates, it makes that a little bit more manageable too.
Okay. Now, of all these milks we've talked about so far, if you're someone who doesn't have any health ailments, you don't have any concerns or anything like that, is there a go-to like milk you should choose if you're standing there at the grocery store looking in the freezer?
Yeah, so if you're going to consume a dairy milk, a standard dairy milk, then I would go for a skim milk.
Okay.
Whether you did ultra filtered or not, skim milk, there's no downside, right? You're removing all of the saturated fats, all of the bad fats that are in the milk that are going to do negative things to your cholesterol levels, but you're leaving all of the good components, right? You're getting the protein from it, you're getting the nutrients, the calcium, the vitamin D that's been added, all of those great things.
Okay. Plant-based milks. These have been very trendy. I myself have leaned towards almond milk in recent years. I think because, I heard that factoid and I was like, wow, I'm going to rethink everything I ever thought about milk and I'm going to drink almond milk now. And I do enjoy almond milk, but I still drink, my wife drinks, whole milk or 2% milk. So it's not like we don't have some no milks allowed signs on a refrigerator. We accept all milks in our kitchen. But people choose to drink plant-based milk for a lot of reasons. And there's a lot more than I thought looking it up. I thought, oh, yeah, almond milk, which I drink sometimes, of course, soy milk, and then maybe something else. But there are more than I thought. So let's go down this list the same way we did plant-based milk. Almond milk. Is it fair to say that's the most popular plant-based milk?
I would say yes. Most people that I talk to that are going the plant-based milk route are usually drinking almond milk.
And what are like the benefits of almond milk, if there are any?
Yeah, so it's a good option. Like we were mentioning the lactose intolerance earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good option for people that have lactose intolerance or even a dairy allergy and can't consume milk at all. Benefits to it. It just kind of gives you something to drink that has a different flavor than water, right?
Yeah, no, definitely having drunk a lot of almond milk and drunk a lot of dairy milk, it tastes different than dairy milk.
Yeah, so it gives you a different option. And if you were somebody maybe that was having cereal, and nobody, I don't think, wants to put water in their cereal, right? So it gives you an option for that too.
And this will apply to all of them, and I guess we can just cover this now. I think when you say milk, dairy milk, cow milk, you understand, hey, you go milk a cow, and there's some milk now in this pail or this tube or wherever, right? Plant-based milk Like, what is the process for getting milk out of these almonds or cashews or whatever it may be?
So it's funny that you asked that, because there was even a little bit of drama with them being called milk in the first place, because it was a little misleading to consumers, and there was kind of a push that really it should be called like almond juice and that kind of thing, because what they're doing really more is like juicing the nut, right? So with the majority of these plant-based things, whatever the plant is, if it's a nut, they soak it in water, they grind it with the water, and then they strain out the pulp. So you are just, sort of ended up with these like soaked and strained nuts.
Yeah, it doesn't really sound like milk. It's like, it doesn't really sound like milk to me when you put it that way.
It doesn't.
But soy milk, right? It's considered a protein milk. Why is this?
So soy naturally has protein in it. And if you think of people that are doing vegetarian or vegan diets, soy is usually one of the go-to plant-based foods that they use to get their protein in. It actually has a complete protein in there, which we don't need to get into right now, right? But meaning it has all the amino acids that like animal-based proteins do. Soy milk actually has protein comparable to dairy milk. It has the same amount, 8 grams of protein, versus a lot of these milks, like the almond milk that you mentioned, have no protein, maybe 1 gram of protein in the milk. And the problem with people switching to plant-based milks is that a lot of times they don't realize that. It's still called milk, so in their mind, it's a complete nutritional equivalent. And that's not the case.
Gotcha. Yeah, in my time drinking almond milk on and off, like I've seen like, oh, well, they have the, with 10 grams of protein, like they add that protein in later. Obviously, oh, well, if they have to add it, there must be deficiencies there. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Now, rice milk, the most recommended hypoallergenic milk? Is that correct?
Probably. You've kind of said they're now coming out with so many different kinds of milk that I feel like that might be, up for debate or changing with time. But yes, it is a hypoallergenic, right? Because you can have people that have soy allergies, people that have nut allergies. Rice is something that I guess people don't have allergies against for whatever reason. Downsides of rice milk, though, so it does have a little bit more carbohydrates. So it has the same number of carbohydrates that regular dairy milk has, but still without that protein.
Okay.
And from a digestion standpoint, really not ideal, especially with the number of people in our society that have problems with blood sugar management. Protein or fat would help slow down the digestion of that. So if you end up with this rice milk that has the same number of carbohydrates, but none of these other good nutrients that slow down the digestion, then not as good for blood sugar.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I mean, obviously there's going to be pros and cons to all these, and here we are. So oat milk, very similar to rice milk, right?
Yes. So it's made from the oats. It's interesting when you look at the labels, it actually shows the carbohydrates on it as being added sugars, but they aren't actually adding in any sugar after the process of making the oat milk. It's just the process of breaking down the oats to make the milk that it turns into these simple sugars that, from the food industry standpoint, are considered added sugars.
Okay. Now, hemp milk. This is a vegan milk, and despite the name, does not contain THC, correct?
So technically there would be trace amounts of THC, but nothing close to amounts that you would have any kind of like psychoactive effects from.
Okay. I didn't know this was a thing. I'm too square, I guess.
And so the benefits of hemp milk, the reason that people would choose that is because of it does have some heart-healthy fats, right? Because it's a seed, right? So it has like some omega-3s and things like that in there. Not huge amounts, but a little bit.
Now, coconut milk. We've all seen the movies where someone's stranded on a desert island and they're drinking coconut milk, right? Now, there's thick and thin coconut milk. What are the differences between those two?
Yeah, so that, again, is going to be fat content, right? Okay. So typically the high-fat coconut milk that you're going to find is going to be the canned kind, right? Mm-hmm. And so usually that's more often used in, like, cooking versus the thin kind, like you're referring to, you'd actually find in the milk aisles. So it's all about percent fat. So the canned kind is could have anywhere from 20 to 50% fat content.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So like heavy whipping cream or something like that. And unfortunately it's all saturated fat. So it's all of those less healthy fats that we were talking about that we don't want to be consuming a lot of. But even the thin coconut milk has a lot of saturated fat in there. So it still has 4 grams of saturated fat per cup.
Oh.
And it has no protein.
And it doesn't really taste well in my experience either. So I've tried it, and I think I've been spoiled, as we all have in our culture by, added sugar and coconut. Like, oh, I love a good coconut candy bar, but I'm not gonna like coconut milk because it tastes more natural, right? So without that sugar there, like when you're expecting one thing and you get something else, it's like, whoa. So like I was turned off to coconut. Well, I tried it. I was intrigued, but I was like, nah, not for me.
Well, and I would say of all the different plant-based milks, that's the one that I would probably recommend the least, just because of the amount of saturated fats in there. So yeah, you're good.
Now, cashew milk. It's like almond milk. It's low in calories and carbs. But is there any tangible difference between that and like almond milk, or is it all basically the same at that point?
It's very similar. Taste difference, slight texture difference. Some people think it has. Well, I guess the only thing from a production standpoint is that because it naturally has a slightly creamier texture, then they use a few less thickening agents in it. So something we haven't really talked about with all of these plant-based milks is that they do add a number of stabilizers and preservatives and thickeners and things like that to help with texture and mouthfeel and, to make it taste good and taste a little bit more comparable to regular milk. So there is a little bit more like preservatives that you're looking at when you look at additives, I suppose I should say, when you're looking at plant-based milks versus just your standard dairy milk.
Now, another milk I never knew existed until doing some research for this, pea milk. Now, it's for you if you're allergic to nuts or soy but want plant-based. That's basically the function of why you would drink pea milk, as I understand it?
Yeah, so pea milk has protein, right? Just like the soy milk did, but then you're not worried about the soy allergies. And some people avoid soy, because they're worried about like the hormones and that sort of research that's been done. But so you don't have any of those concerns with the pea milk, but you get the protein from it still.
Well, you were talking about the process of like them getting milk from these plants and nuts. We've all had canned peas before. There's juice in there. Does it taste like that, or what, how does it?
It doesn't, and it's not even made from green peas. It's actually made from a yellow split pea, so it does not have a pea flavor. But I mean, as I'm sure you know from having tried some of these other milks, almond milks and things like that, they do have, almond milk has maybe a slightly nutty flavor to it, so it might have a slightly earthier flavor to it than like a dairy milk would, but it does not taste like peas. But another interesting thing about pea milk that we didn't really go into, so one of the reasons that people might choose plant-based milks is from the environmental standpoint, right? Environmental concerns and things like that. And so pea milk has a very small environmental footprint compared to some of the other milks.
Okay.
So it doesn't take a lot of water or greenhouse gases or things like that to produce the pea milk. So it's one of the more environmentally friendly options from the plant-based milks.
Interesting. So in summation of these milks, I know we talked, some about like protein, things like that, but like the overall benefits of plant-based milk, and then, it sounds like protein might be the main thing you might be missing if you're exclusively drinking.
It is, right? And it's beneficial for us to have at least some protein kind of at each of our meals. And so my thought always goes to like a lot of people are using milk in their cereal, right? And cereals tend to be high in sugar and not a good source of protein and that sort of thing. So it does come down to a little bit like what are you using your milk for and when are you having it? But because of that, I do tend to lean towards recommending plant-based milks that have some kind of protein in them. So for that reason, I actually really like the pea milks.
Okay.
Because they're a good source of protein. And actually, with the pea milk, they extract the pea protein concentrate. So they're zero carb as well. So you don't have to worry about a lot of carbohydrates or anything in the pea milks either. And you're still getting this great protein. And one thing that we haven't mentioned with all of this is that the standard nut milks, pea milks, all of that on the shelves tend to be sweetened. So if you just get original almond milk, it has added sugars in it. About the same amount as the chocolate milk did.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you gotta look for that unsweetened label on it, right?
Correct, yes. But a lot of times you have to specifically hunt for that unsweetened kind. And if they say vanilla, that usually means sugar as well, right? So like a vanilla almond milk, they didn't just put like vanilla extract in there. They put vanilla and sugar in there, right? So just something to keep in mind with looking for those milks that If you're buying a sweetened one, then that is definitely not going to be the healthiest way to go. But if you are getting an unsweetened kind, then that's, has some health benefits to it potentially.
No, those are some great tips looking for those specific things. If you're,
Yes.
if you're sitting there and you want to go plant milk and you're in front of the freezer and you're looking for, whatever the best fit for you may be, those are some great things to look out for.
Absolutely. And one other thing to mention too is that if we're buying it from the stores, most of the commercial brands are going to have calcium and vitamin D added to them to give them those nutrients comparable to what we would be getting in dairy milk, right? So if we're trying to replace our dairy milk with the almond milk like you did, you're still getting your calcium and vitamin D. But now if you start looking, there are a lot of recipes out there for making homemade almond milk, homemade cashew milk, a lot of these things at your house so that you can avoid some of those preservatives and stabilizers and all of that, like I mentioned earlier. But you're not adding calcium and vitamin D to it at home, right? So then all of a sudden you're losing out on these really great nutrients because, again, people just aren't made aware, I suppose, of the differences.
No, that's a great point. I mean, we have very carefully constructed food pyramids and diet recommendations, but those only work when you're following those, and then you start switching out ingredients of this or that, and the whole thing just kind of falls apart that way. So that's good to be mindful of. Well, Kelly, this has been extremely informative. Thank you for going down the list of milk here. I'm glad all these options exist because it's good. It's good to have options for whatever reasons that you need to explore other options of milk. And ultimately, no matter what kind of milk you're drinking, I think it's important that you're drinking a glass of milk every now and then, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right? You do get good nutrient value from the milk. So it's definitely not something that we need to be fearful of or not have or, anything like that. And if we want to have a chocolate or sweetened version for fun sometimes, that can be a fun way to still get some of those nutrients too.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Kelly.
Thanks for having me.
So, Katie, there are a lot of milks out there, aren't there?
There are a lot of milks. Like so many that as we were going down the list, I was just like, wow, another one. And I kept saying that probably like five more times after I thought I would finish. The one I had heard the least about were the pea milks.
Yes. Which is one that she recommended.
I know. So I will say that wasn't really a popular one when I was drinking more plant-based milk. So I think I might actually go back and try that.
Yeah.
And see if I like it.
And when I have changed my milk habits, it's not because I felt like, oh, my stomach hurts, I'm lactose intolerant. It was like, oh, let me just try this new trend of plant-based milk and see what it's all about, right? And it was really surprising to me that lactose intolerance is actually the majority of the population.
Yeah, I guess kind of surprised to hear that, but maybe not. I mean, I don't know if that I've ever looked up, the statistics on that. I know that I slowly have gotten worse and worse over time. And it's not something that's easy to ignore, obviously. So if milk bothers you, I would say, or as it starts to bother you. Yeah, but I was going to ask I forgot to ask, I guess, why you settled on trying plant milks. I mean, did you think they were healthier? Or you just wanted to try something different?
Yeah, it was in my I'm going to be really healthy phase. And I was borderline pescatarian. I was drinking water most of the time. So I was like, hey, let's try some different stuff, right? So this is a few years ago. And I've become much less healthy since. And as you've heard, if you listen to this podcast, so that was just part of that. I was like, I'll try this out.
Well, this is the one episode where you have you often say you're going to take something away and do something about it. But it sounds like you kind of mentioned off the top that you're going to go back to dairy milk.
I'm kind of ahead of the curve on this one, I guess.
Yeah. So this is the one that really caught your attention. The case was made.
Yeah. No, I mean, milk, this is a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for a while and get to the bottom of it. Because I too, I think a lot of listeners probably feel intimidated when you go to the grocery store and you see aisle after aisle or shelf after shelf of what is this now? How could there possibly be so many kinds of milks? And what does that even mean?
Yeah. I loved when you asked her about the benefits of almond milk, and her answer was pretty much, if you want a different taste to water.
Yeah,
it's just okay, so there's no benefits.
That was crushing to me
because
that was my go-to milk. I was like, I have to make a change.
Essentially,
now.
This is just kind of like water. Now you get the protein fortified, so that brings it closer back to dairy milk again. But I think a non-protein fortified, and then it needs to be unsweetened as well, which a lot of people are probably accidentally drinking sweetened almond milk. I mean, she basically just called an alternative to water, which I kind of found funny because nobody thinks they get any nutritional value out of water.
Right.
Obviously, water does important things, but not.
That's one of the great things when you're counting your calories. You just drink water.
Exactly.
I don't have to count these.
There you go.
But there's definitely different tastes between plant-based milk and dairy milk. I mean, that's just how it is. But as she pointed out as well, there's different tastes between skim milk and whole milk, right? There's different levels to this, and it's really just a personal preference, unless you, of course, have some health reason,
Yeah.
right, to make a change.
Yeah. I'm glad y'all talked about the difference between like whole and skim and things like that. That's something that I like generally have been confused about. And then also like, is skim milk really the healthiest choice? And it kind of sounded like it was, just because there's none of that fat. So, none of the saturated fat. So that's something that I drink just begrudgingly almost for my health. And that sounded like a, hey, it's worth it moment for me, where it's like, yeah, I keep getting skim, 1%. If that's all they have. Like one of the coffee shops I go to, all they have is like 1%. But that was interesting. And she really likes the ultra filtered milk.
Yeah, she's a big fan of that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. It gets a little pricey, so I don't do it all the time. But I like it too because it's lactose free. It has like more protein, less carbs. It kind of like fits the bucket of like, you're still getting nutrition out of it, but then it's cutting back on the stuff that like you don't need a ton of anyways, kind of thing. I know she brought up the ultra filtered chocolate milk. Zach, you should try it.
I think I might.
I do a splash of that in my coffee sometimes, just to make it like a little bit like a mocha latte kind of vibe. And also to sweeten it a little, just a tad. Like I'll do a splash, and that's like I won't put anything else in it. And the ultra filtered chocolate milk is really good.
Okay, noted. I'll be trying that.
I didn't know that it had artificial sweeteners in it though, so that was something that like no wonder it's so tasty. I was like, how are they doing this?
There's a give and take somewhere with all these things.
Of course, always.
So you're gonna stick with the ultra filtered?
Yeah. I would say ultra filtered, or I just do the lactose free skim milk. Those are. I think I'm like, honestly, like what I was already doing seemed to get like a pretty solid, upvote. So
yeah, because I had been on the fence about like, should I? Because my wife drinks just dairy milk, and she's like, why do we need two different milks in the refrigerator? I'm like, well, I drink plant-based milk,
Yeah. I'm healthier than you.
I have this merit badge on for drinking plant-based milk, right? But now I'm like, well, no, we'll just get the bigger carton of dairy milk now.
Yeah.
And we'll see. I mean, like, again, that's the thing. I'm glad there's options for people out there, because some people do need the different kinds of milks. But it was very enlightening to have her react to a lot of these different kinds of milk. So Kelly did a great job going through
It's a fascinating
the ins
conversation.
and outs of milk.
Yeah, something as simple as milk, which you just don't even think about, ended up being like a pretty fascinating conversation.
Yeah, those are the topics I really enjoy covering, at least when I'm, doing the interviews on this podcast. Just like your everyday stuff that's in your house that you don't even think about, and then you're just doing, without much thought every day. And like, let's explore that. Why are you doing these things you do? And I don't need to drink almond milk anymore, I've learned. So there you have it.
It's just an alternative to water.
Which is 90% of our bodies.
Oh boy, here we go.
Anyway, that's going to do it for this episode of On Health with Houston Methodist. Please share, like, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We drop episodes Tuesday mornings. So until then, stay tuned and stay healthy.